Good evening, everyone. Um, I'm Rupert Koopman, and welcome to our fourth BotSoc Crew and Sandy Conservation webinar. Um, we've covered quite a lot of ground so far, and we look forward to covering even more in your company. So I'm the Conservation Manager at the Botanical Society of South Africa, and basically, what we wanted to achieve with this webinar series is that it was a joint discussion from the BotSoc Conservation Committee, Crew, Council, to see how we could put together a range of accessible information on the national as well as BotSoc's plant conservation strategy. And it almost forces us to take the jargon out of the science and put it together in an accessible way for you to all access at home. So just from a housekeeping point of view, there is a chat box. So if you want to do general chat in there, questions for the presenters go in the Q&A section. And yeah, we're going to go right into it quite shortly. The other thing is, if you haven't checked, at 6:15, there will be a post-webinar Zoom meeting, which is a lot more relaxed. It's not streamed on YouTube, so we can have open conversations there. And yeah, I think we always achieve quite a lot in terms of just cohesion, because ultimately we want to be building community and an informed community which can respond and support, respond to the threats and support the plant conservation efforts in South Africa and broader actually. So I just want to start off with a slide on my side, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. My ex-colleagues at Cape Nature, I asked them to send me through something, because I think this is quite a key thing for plant lovers. Is actually, you know, plants are not these things that we can just pick up next to the road as we want to. There's a whole suite of legislation that that protects them. But if you were to go onto social media, which we will hear about later, and you know, people just picking plants and foraging and doing all sorts of things, there's actually a long list of paperwork that people should be having, and that's from local authority bylaws through to ordinances, and national things like NEMA, etc. We will get into the long list of legislation later, but these all apply. So what I wanted to say also is the fact that if you're not yet a Botanical Society member, I encourage you to check out our website and our social media channels and join us, because we really want to be building community for people who want to know, grow, protect, and enjoy South Africa's plants. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking shortly, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker. And the nice thing about using these platforms is the fact that we can now access people across the world. So we've got someone from London. I'm in Bellville. We've got Ishmael in Kirstenbosch, someone in Kamiskroon, as well as Pretoria. So it just shows that the reach of our plants and the technology. Robin, if you can start sharing your screen and also switch on your camera while I do your introduction, please. Okay, so I met Robin when she was still an intern at Sandy a long time ago. And she is a South African botanist who did her PhD at the University of the Western Cape, focusing on the Conophytum clade, looking at the taxonomy, phylogenetics, and population genetics of the Conophytums. She's currently based at Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew in the genomics lab, and her current research is focused on genomics in Azoaceae and Crassulaceae, with a specific focus on endopolyploidy, which I'm sure she'll tell us about. So, Robin, please go ahead and inform us. And it's good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Great. Can you see my I assume you can see my screen and see me, I hope.
Yeah, I'm just put onto full share, please.
Oh yeah, sorry. There we go. Is that better?
Awesome, thank you.
Good. Okay, so thanks Rupert for the introduction. It's great to see familiar faces and be part of a South African thing again. Yeah, it's really nice. So I thought today I'd just kind of share into my little magical world of mesons. First things first. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, first things first, I know you're all aware of the Succulent Karoo. It's a biodiversity hotspot. It includes approximately 6,350 species, 40 of which are only found in the area. And as you can imagine, as part of the Succulent Karoo, 4 of the 5 most dominant families are actually succulent. And Azoaceae, the family in which I specialize, is by far the most dominant family in the Succulent Karoo. So, oops, sorry about that. Okay, so focusing on Azoaceae specifically, it's a succulent plant family with approximately 1,800 species. It's commonly referred to as mesons, as it was previously classified in the family Mesembryanthemaceae. And the family is characterized by succulent leaves and hygrocastic capsules. So these capsules are an adaptation to arid environments. So you can see here, they're closed. But when they come into contact with water, they actually have this unique seed dispersal mechanism, and they open up and they have these diverse structures within the capsules, which are used to actually describe species and, of course, aid in identification of taxa. So I'm going to show you a video now. Hopefully it works. Okay, perfect. So this is just actually how the capsule opens, and we can see the structures inside. So we start off with a closed capsule here, and we can see it's opening. So as it gets wet, it opens up. And we have all these really interesting structures. So we have what they call the expanding keels, which are kind of like the hinges that allow the capsule to open. We have the little valve wings. And we also have what's really important are these covering membranes. They're not in all the species of Azoaceae, but in this one specifically, they cover these seeds. So this is the little seed. Rupert, can you see my pointer, or anyone? I just want to check.
Oops. Yes, we can see it.
Yeah? Okay, I'll just continue. I assume you can see my pointer. Yeah, so what happens is as a raindrop falls on these covering membranes, the seed then shoots out. And what's also important about these covering membranes, it makes sure that not all the seeds kind of fall out every time there's a rainfall event. And so it maintains it for kind of the best way to optimize survival of the species. So that a few seeds are dispersed during some rainfall events and then maintained for future rainfall events. And then as the capsule dries again, so that it's completely open, as it dries, it closes again. Okay. So Azoaceae species specifically, but a lot of the species in the Succulent Karoo grow in very specific niches. For instance, in the top left corner, you can see a Conophytum obcordelum growing in this rock crevice. And there's also a range of sizes, and this enables species to coexist in the same area. For instance, we might have a Riccia shrub growing together with a Caryopsis, which is a more kind of compact plant, growing with a stone plant of Conophytum. And these different sizes enable the species to grow together without outcompeting one another. And then within the stone plant specifically, we've got species that occupy micro niches. So for instance, we have Conophytum pagii here growing in this quartz, together with, at this point, we also have Conophytum subfenestratum, as well as Conophytum calculus. We have a Crasula deceptor here, and we have some bulbs that I'm not necessarily very familiar with. And then, yeah, so these really kind of micro niches allow species to grow together, and this leads to a high diversity of species in a very small area, which is why it's so exciting to work in the Succulent Karoo. Moving on to Conophytum specifically, as this is what I focus on for my PhD. It's a stone plant genus endemic to Southern Africa. The distribution of Conophytum follows the distribution of the Succulent Karoo really well. there's 108 species classified into 16 sections, and the sections are characterized based on leaf and floral characters. So just highlighting some of the larger and more well-defined sections within Conophytum. We have section Conophytum, which follows the kind of southeasterly extent of the distribution. These species are nocturnal flowering. We have section Biloba, which has a very prominent two-lobed leaf, so almost like little bunny ears. Section Cataphracta, which often has a very chalky look. Section Ophthalmophyllum, which occurs in bushmanland, so the northeastern extent of the distribution. Section Barbata, which often has hairs. And then section Wettsteinii is quite a large section and full of all different species. So then moving on to Conophytum leaf characters, they really have these unusual and diverse leaf characters. For instance, we have windowed leaves here. This species and many other windowed leaf species actually in the wild, so this is in the glasshouse, in the wild they are submerged and all that remains above ground is the windowed leaves, and it's a translucent section. So what happens is the sunlight is able to penetrate the leaf and get to the photosynthetic tissue, even though the species is underground. And it's normally underground because it's protecting itself from the extreme heat in the area. What's interesting is the next species is Conophytum marginatum. It grows together in the same area as the most of the windowed species. And although it doesn't have windowed leaves on the top, it grows in the rock crevices and has these little windowed spots. So it has a similar kind of character, but in a different way. We then have Conophytum stephanii, which have really big trichomes, so long hairs. And this species occurs in fog areas, and we think these trichomes are there so to kind of capture the fog and to use the moisture. Conophytum obcordelum have really interesting markings. There's a whole group such as this Conophytum cummings-bergensis, which have these epidermal warts, which are also quite cool looking. Then, as I mentioned before, we've got these with chalky epidermises, so chalky skins. This is like Conophytum calculus. This is due to there's a high amount of calcium oxalate crystals in the leaf. And then finally, an example is Conophytum mornii, which have red pigments. These pigments develop throughout the season, and so it kind of acts as like a sunblock for the leaves. Not only do we have really interesting leaf characters, but the floral characters or flowers really make Conophytum interesting. Majority of them flower in autumn. So those of you that know the area, most of the other species that occur in the succulent crew either flower in winter or spring, where in autumn Conophytum is really the only thing that flowers. So what's nice is you see, well, it's really unusual because you see this plant that's gone into dormancy during the summer period, and as soon as flowering season starts, just the flowers emerge, and you've left with like almost looks like a dead plant with these little flowers. So it's quite exciting to see. In addition, although most of them are autumn, some of them have shifted their flowering season from autumn to winter or spring, and some even flower in summer. Most of the flowers open during the day, but some species are nocturnal. And then even within the day flowering species, we have some species that open in the afternoon and some even a really small window in the late afternoon. So Conophytum also has tubular flowers with different floral structures. So the petaloid staminodes fuse to form this tube, which is unique within the family. And then also depending on the position of the anthers and the stigmas, we have different structures. We find the complete range of flower color in Azoraceae within Conophytum as well, and as well as varying degrees of that. As well as floral scents, and we find various floral scents, and the scent correlates really strongly with sugar nectar content. Then finally, just some results from my PhD to highlight. So ecologically, Conophytum is also really interesting because up to 10 species can be found together, and this is really unusual. However, what we found is the differences in flowering time allows several species to occupy the same habitat. So for instance, if you had two species co-occurring, one would be diurnal and one would be nocturnal, and where they have the same flowering time, they might have different flowering season or flower color, flower structure. So there's different floral syndromes that keep these species apart. Otherwise, they would have just hybridized and become one species. And then finally, my population genetics result, just to highlight that the capsules may in fact also be wind dispersed, which leads to more complexity. So not only are you having species that are co-occurring and then separating, you're also having new species coming into the area and then acclimatize to these microniches and potentially form a new species. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Robin. That's awesome. I just also wanted to say to the audience is that just because tonight we very much focus on the Azoaceae facies, doesn't mean that we don't have lots and lots of other succulents in South Africa or Southern Africa. There's the Crassula, there's daisies, some pelargoniums try and be fleshy as well. So we really are blessed with these succulents. And they're under pressure. Ishmael, thanks, Robin. You can turn off your camera that side, and we'll bring you in later. Ishmael, if you could turn on your camera, microphone, and start sharing your screen. So to most of you, Ishmael Ibrahim will need very little introduction. He's sorry, you're going to have to give me that title, but he basically runs Winter Rainfall Crew, the custodians of rare and endangered wildflowers. And as such, he is covering most of the two major parts of the hotspots, as mentioned in South Africa. You're still on mute, Ishmael. And his background is initially in horticulture, and he got a shout out in the second webinar around his involvement in Proteatlas. And he really is, when you talk about threatened plants in the southwestern part of the country, his name will come up at some stage. But he's going to give us some feedback after Robin's introduced us now to how cool the Conophytums are as to what their status has been and starting to introduce some of the threats. So thank you very much.
Rupert, are you seeing the full screen?
No, put it on presentation mode. Good.
Now?
Yeah, also
good.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone. It's good to be here and to, oh my God, sorry. I forgot to take off one of those, like, what do you call those? Auto changing the slide thingies. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so thanks very much to Robin for really setting the scene and for making us excited about Conophytums and mesems in general. I unfortunately have to burst that bubble a little bit, but I shall also try and bring some good news and not just give you the bleak situation of what we're in right now, but also just some positive stories about, you know, how we can help and what we have done thus far. Okay, so I just want to talk about the monitoring and assessment of the Conophytums. So as Rupert said, our crew is mainly focused down in the Fynbos region, but in the last few years we've been working a lot in the Northern Cape, and you know, this poaching issue has come up quite significantly over the last 2 years particularly. So the succulent trade has really boomed in the last 2 years. And there's been a specific interest in caduciform species. So those things that have like fat succulent stems. And for some reason, the Conophytums have been really hard hit in the last 2 years. So this is not a new thing. Like collecting plants in the wild is not a new thing. But at this current quantities that we're seeing and the frequency and the amount of plants that are being harvested in the wild, I don't think there's ever been a time that we've recorded this many like kind of plants being taken out from the wild. So it is quite a serious concern for us, and we are trying our best to make sure that species don't go extinct. So last year with the lockdown, we thought that, you know, there will be some relief for the plants, seeing that foreign and most of the kind of culprits were foreign visitors, and we really thought that that the lockdown would stop, or at least slow down the collecting in the wild. But unfortunately, it had the opposite effect, where the foreigners were now using local people to collect the plants and then to post them or to courier or move them into the international market. And what this has done is that now we suspect that there's lots of locals that are not really aware of the conservation importance of the species. They basically just been given information to say, here's a picture of what I want. It's here in this place. They get sent to locality, and off you go and find it, and you send it to us and we pay you. And so that becomes a real problem, because through the kind of social media, and we'll hear more about that later on, but through the social media, these deals are brokered quite easily. And also the value of these plants are now becoming known, and so now there's more interest from the locals, but also it seems like there are more kind of criminal syndicates getting involved in succulent poaching as well. And syndicates that are involved in, like, rhino warns or perlamon or whatever. So it seems like there's a lot of attention on succulent plants at the moment. Okay, so tonight I really want to talk about just the Conophytums, because they are really at the highest risk right now. There are also like serious risks for some of the caudiciform species, like some of the Mansonias and Avonias and Campsaras, those kind of things. But by far, Conophytums have been the hardest hit in the last 2 years. So just looking, this is work that was done by our colleagues in the threatened species unit, where when the issue of poaching became evident, we had to really look at the status of some of these species. So in late 2019 and 2020, some of the species were reassessed. And the last time a reassessment was, or some of the species was assessed, was in 2015. And so this is just data showing the increase in the number of species in the different categories between 2015 and 2020. And you can see that, there's been a large increase in the number of critically endangered, and even in vulnerable species. And many of these species were listed as rare because there weren't like particular threats recorded for them, or they were listed as vulnerable D2, which means that they have a very small range, but there's a potential threat. And as soon as that threat became a real thing, where we now had evidence that, these plants are being poached and being taken out of the wild, because of the restricted range, those species immediately jumped to like the highest categories. And so we are, they will continue to red list the rest of the Conophytums. This was just a subset, the ones that we really knew that was in trouble, that was reassessed. But it's likely that if we do a full reassessment of all the species, a lot of species are going to come into these like higher categories, like critically endangered and endangered. And I think we'll see a large proportion of the whole genus being highly threatened. Okay, so just to also share that 12 species just in that period between 2015 and 2020 has been uplisted into critically endangered, and critically endangered is basically the highest level of threat. And this is just one example of a species. I'm not going to name any names of species because we want to kind of keep this out of the, we just want to not mention names of species. So this species was listed as vulnerable D2 in 2015. It's a range restricted species, and in 2020 it was listed as critically endangered, and it's basically known from one tiny area, one little mountain in the Namaqualand region. And this is highly, highly sought after by the collectors, and so they are very threatened. Then this is just another example of a species that was least concerned. We weren't worried about it at all. And then it's jumped all the way to vulnerable. And this is another species that is also a range restricted endemic from the Richtersveld, and now is considered vulnerable. Okay, so that's just in that last assessment in 2020, 34 species has increased in their status out of the 104 species that Robin mentioned. And you can see here we've just listed the different categories and just shown where those species were before that kind of jumped up. So the red bars here in critically endangered, those things were all listed as vulnerable D2, and they jumped immediately to critically endangered. And then also here, importantly, to look at a lot of these species that were rare and critically rare, sorry, rare and critically rare, because there's now evidence of a threat, they've immediately come into vulnerable because of their restricted range. Okay, and then we also have like all these widespread species that are still least concerned, but we are very worried about them just because the numbers that appear in confiscated material just shows to us that, you know, these species populations are being quite hard hit in the wild. And we are currently just going to these populations to try and get baseline data so that we can update their red list status. Okay, and then another interesting analysis that the red list team did was just to look at the red list index. So this is, and we do this for the National Biodiversity Assessment, where we look at the changes over time and how species are doing. And so obviously if these lines are going down, it means that, you know, the biodiversity is being threatened and we are losing species, or and you can see that they mapped just plants in general, how, in terms of like how many populations we're losing. So there is a very slight downward trend. They also mapped the cycads, which is considered to be the most threatened plant group in the country. They're showing the trend line of like how many populations are lost. But then you can see if we map the Conophytums just in this period from 2015 to 2020, you can see it's just a dramatic loss of populations. And if this trend continues, we will actually see some real extinctions in the field. So we basically have to halt that trend right now. So this is just a map showing all the threatened Conophytums, and you can see the concentration of them are mostly around that area in that Namaqualand region. There are a few species like in other parts of the country, or in the Northern Cape and the Western Cape mainly, but that is really the hotspot of where these plants occur. And then these are all the species that we term critical habitat, all the Conophytums that are critical habitat species. And that means that the entire global range is in an area of less than 10 square kilometers, which is tiny, it's minute. And many of these species are known from just one mountain, for one little ridge. And they could be known like, you know, from an area of maybe, you know, a few hectares, and that is their total global population. So these things are extremely restricted, and the thing that we're worried about is that these species are the ones that are most likely to be harvested to extinction, because some of them are just so rare that they occur on one little copy, and if you go there and collect all the plants, that's it for the species. Okay, so one of the really scary things is also, and at least let me say one of the good things is that through like fantastic work by law enforcement officials and the department and the Green Scorpions, the number of cases where the poachers are being caught and the material is being confiscated is increasing. So at least we're getting to know like how these things are moved and where these guys are moving, and we're able to, and the law enforcement is able to stop them before the plants leave the country. But the problem is that still thousands and thousands of plants are actually being harvested from the wild, and these things are caught either at customs or while they're being transported for the international market. And so we've been working very closely with our botanical garden partners, and a lot of the material that is confiscated come to the botanical gardens for safekeeping, and then they are kind of moved to the most suitable place where they can be protected. So this is just a graph showing the numbers of plants that have been brought to botanical gardens, and you can see that by far Conophytum pagei is the most collected plant, and that is found in this confiscated consignments. So we've already recorded over 30,000 plants that's been coming to the botanical gardens, and in total there's been over 120,000 plants that's come in the last year, that's come to botanical gardens in Sandby and in other places. And so this is a real serious problem. As you can see, the most targeted genera is the Conophytum genus. And so these plants come, we have to count them. And so it's really sad to see this confiscated material come to the gardens, but you know, there is an opportunity for us to harvest seeds so that we can bolster our ex situ collections. And we're also trying to work out the most sensible way of moving these plants back into the wild, or to use these plants as mother stock to actually make material available to supply the demand that's out there for these cool plants. So I just want to highlight some of the main conservation interventions that we've done in 2020 and 2021, since we've really found out like how serious this problem is. So we started off with a big workshop last year in February, and we just brought together all the stakeholders and just discussed like what is actually, and just to get a nice sense of what is actually happening and what the scale of the problem is. We've had several meetings since then, but then because of lockdown and the COVID-19, you know, in terms of like what we could do, slowed down a little bit. But then later in the year, last year, we had a webinar with all our Sandby colleagues, and we were just feeling that we needed more people to actually come on board and help us like tackle this problem. So we had a Sandby-wide webinar, and that included some senior management officials in Sandby. And basically, we're trying to kind of raise the issue at the department level, where nationally we can gain support from the department to actually fast track the work that we are trying to do to save these plants. And then last year we did a field trip just to investigate some of the species that have been found in confiscated material that we knew were very restricted, just to go to those populations and see what the damage are. And we found that some species were known from, you know, around 1,000 plants. We only managed to find like 100 plants or less than 100 plants. And so those populations were really, really knocked back quite badly. And so since then, we've been working with our botanical gardens partners just to look at how do we go out and collect at least seeds of all these plants, so that, you know, if there is a poaching event, unfortunately, that these populations are now at critical low numbers, that we actually have the ex situ material to be able to repopulate those species. And so currently that is our main focus, is just getting out there, getting as much seed as possible of all these restricted species, and just getting them into ex situ collection, so that, you know, we have a kind of insurance plan if they go extinct in the future. And then we also had to address the issue around the sensitivity of data. And so we've developed also an interim sensitive species list just to look at things that are being targeted at the moment, and to look at how do we use that sensitive species list to block all the information that we have, especially the locality information, to block the locality information for all those species. So we've been engaging with the iNaturalist team, and we've sent them a very big list of over 500 plants that we want them to obscure the localities, the locality information. And essentially, when we came back from our field trip in September last year, we and saw how serious the problem was, we immediately obscured the localities of all the Conophytums on iNaturalist immediately. So just all of the species we obscured. And then we also engaging with all the key role players in the landscape, all our funding partners and the departments and the provincial conservation agencies to come up with a national response plan. And fortunately, we are getting fantastic support, and we've really been using the SANBI channels and our conservation partners to really raise the urgency of this. And so the department has really come on board and supported the work that we're doing thus far. And in the next year, there will be a lot more work done on trying to mitigate the impact of illegal succulent trade. Okay, there's just an example of what we've done on INAT. So all the Conophytums, they have now been obscured. So the locality points are just in a randomized block. So you don't really have access to that information anymore. And then we will be engaging with observers on iNaturalist to be able to get the information for red listing purposes. So there is a way where people can trust certain users so that we can get the obscured data. Okay, so some of the challenges, just quickly, the Kneesvlakte, Richtersveld, Curries area, the Namakwa National Park are currently the heavily targeted areas, but these are also the hotspots for plant diversity and centers of endemism. So all those like really cool species occur in these areas. And so the numbers of plants and species that have been targeted is quite high. Then there are 48 Conophytums that are known as critical habitat species that have total global populations of less than 10 square kilometers. They are at great risk, but also to go out and collect 48 species, some of them are like really remote. And so, you know, in a 1 week field trip, we basically can target 5 species. So it's going to take a lot of effort to actually get all 48 species into ex situ conservation collections. And then the lack of economic opportunities in the Northern Cape, particularly, is driving the locals to become involved. There's really just not much you can do in that area. And so, you know, this is something that, you know, that is attracting people to, because there is large amounts of money that is moving around for poached plants. And then obviously these remote areas make it very challenging to monitor the plants because you have to travel far distances to get the species. And then we're looking at like technological solutions to help deter poachers. There's no working solutions right now, but we are looking at like how we can introduce technological solutions like drones or marking plants with and camera traps and those kind of things. So we are racking our brains on how we can get better technological solutions. And then there's a dire need for community engagement. So we really need to be talking to communities, making them aware of the special nature of the plants and, you know, how, you know, these plants could disappear if they are irresponsibly harvested. And then maybe look at, you know, possible opportunities for creating livelihoods. There is definitely a demand for these plants internationally. And there could be great benefit to communities in these areas that, but it's going to take hard work. And at the moment, like going and grabbing plants out of the wild is just way easier than going through the whole process of setting up nurseries and that kind of thing. So, but we need to look at sustainable solutions and develop livelihoods. And then obviously the nurseries are all really under pressure. and we need to look at how we store this confiscated material, but also how do we make it work for conservation. Okay, so how you can help? This is a very challenging question, especially when members of the public are asking what we can do to help, because most of this is happening in a kind of criminal environment, and we don't really want people to get too involved in going out there and stopping people or whatever. So we have to let the kind of process run and the right officials do their work. But we are in desperate need of crew volunteers that are based in the Northern Cape. So if we know of people that are really keen on plants, and obviously that we know has got the right intentions and are not into illegal activities, we really need people that can help us monitor these plants in the Northern Cape, because it's really difficult to get out there all the time. And then you can report any poaching or illegal trade activities. And even if you are, a lot of us that are plant experts get contacted by people for locality information. And so, if that happens, just be cognizant that you can report that. And then also be conscious about sharing your pictures and locality details, and don't share it with anybody that you don't know or trust. And then, we all need to raise awareness about this, but, disclosing the values of these are not helping, because they're just kind of making people excited about the fact that they can go out and collect a few plants and make thousands of rand. So we need to raise awareness about the negative impacts, but also maybe possible sustainable livelihood opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ishmael. Yeah, you brought a lot of detail there, and you also actually answered quite a few of the questions in the chat. So well done.
I'm pretty sure I went over time.
It's okay. We're going to ask you to stay on for a little bit, because I know that you've got to leave to break fast. But to respond to those questions, so the session won't end at 6. Maybe it's 6:05. Okay, cool. Stop your sharing, and we're going to go to our next presenter, who is from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And just to reiterate what Ishmael has mentioned, is chosen not to be named for this presentation, just to show that we are dealing with a trade where there are significant criminal elements as well. So please go ahead, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Just give me 1 sec to share with you.
You're a little bit soft, so just speak up. Thank you.
Okay.
I do. Thank you.
All right. So I do see we are running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to just be quite brief. I've prepared for you just a short presentation around the online trade in South African succulents. And so South Africa possesses almost half of the world's succulent plant species. So it's really no surprise that this country is a major target destination for illegal harvest to supply the market. And there are 2 broad sort of types of succulents that are at risk. And those are the dwarf succulents, particularly Conophytum, and then the caudiciform succulents. And caudiciforms occur in very many families, Aloinopsis, Avonia, Anacampsaros, Monsonia, Pelargoniums. So there are very many caudiciforms in different families. And the growing use of the internet poses a very significant challenge to the conservation of species that are targeted for wild harvest. And social media in particular is a facilitator of illegal trade, as well as legal trade, but obviously we're more concerned with the illegal trade. And the reasons for this is one, that social media really does stimulate desire amongst collectors. What the eyes see, the heart wants. And oftentimes when you go and look at people's posts of succulent plants on social media, if you go and look in the comments, very often you will see comments such as, wow, I've never seen that before. and immediately followed by, I must have it, I want it. So it really does stimulate the desire amongst collectors of succulents. And then the other major problem with social media is that it facilitates every step of the illegal trade, from advertising to communications to the exchange of money. You know, sometimes things are openly advertised on pages, other times, you know, conversations will go to platforms such as Messenger then, or to WhatsApp, or to direct messenger on social media. So that really does pose a huge problem. Then I've just included a few slides just to give you some examples of wild specimens that we see for sale on the internet in general. And there are four main arenas. Number one is specialist nursery websites. So these are some examples of all wild specimens, you know, from Czechoslovakia and Thailand, and from the UK, from Belgium, from Germany, such like. The next is sale of wild plants on auction sites. Everyone will be familiar with sites like eBay, but there are also Asian sites, Asian auction sites. This one particularly pulled out for you just to show Conophytum. And oftentimes, especially with the Conophytums, you will see that there are, you know, locality details sort of attached to it. So for many collectors, it's important for them, or significant to them, to want to have one of each form from specific areas. So that is why they include these, you know, places of origins, or often the collector numbers and such. And then these are some examples of wild plants for sale on Facebook. As I mentioned, sometimes they are on public pages and accessible by everybody. Sometimes they're on people's personal pages. Very often, though, a lot of the stuff goes on in private groups, which are obviously more difficult to monitor and see what's going on there. And then this is an example of some wild plants for sale on Instagram. So why do people want our succulents? Our succulents are highly collectible. We have the greatest species diversity of succulents. So there really is a huge variety of shapes and forms and sizes and colors, and very many species within specific genera that are collectible. And two of the main reasons why wild plants or wild forms are in demand is A, because of aesthetics. So particularly when you're looking at the caudiciform species, a lot of the caudaxes typically in habitat will grow underground, but then in cultivation, in people's collections, they're planted above ground, and they're almost planted, especially in the East, they are regarded as succulent bonsais. And the shapes that are formed over many, many years in nature are not shapes that can be reproduced in cultivation. So they are very appealing. And the second is that because these plants are usually slow growing and long-lived species, it takes a long time to be able to produce these species by artificial cultivation. So it's far easier and obviously far more profitable to go and collect them from the wild instead of having to wait a minimum of 5 or 6 years to cultivate a specimen that would be of a size that is, appealing to a consumer. And I've included at the bottom there, that's it was previously called Avonia quinaria. It's now called Anacampsaros quinaria. And just to give you an indication of how exceedingly slow growing these species are, the first picture on the left bottom there is a seedling. It's about a year-old seedling. The next picture is 3-year-old plants. And then the third picture is the exact same plant as the second, but exactly 3 years later. And you can see that in 3 years, the growth is very minimal. And that is growth in an artificial environment where all the plant's needs are met. Out in nature, obviously, these plants occur in an arid region, so the growth rate is a lot slower in nature. But then you get to the last picture, and that is the size of plants that are being sold online, that are in trade and on the international market. So you can see that last plant is probably at the very least 100 years old. And then what are the repercussions of harvesting these plants from the wild? Usually, particularly with the caudiciform species, they can't be grown from cuttings. So the entire plants are usually removed during wild collection. And again, because these are long-lived and slow-growing species, they are dependent on the survival of adults to maintain the populations. The adults are the ones that reproduce and produce seed, and they are the ones that persist through years of drought and difficulty to produce, a few young plants. So we need those adults to keep the populations alive. Once we take out these adults from the populations, we are affecting the population structure and affecting their life strategy. So it really is a huge impact to populations, and we don't know what the tipping point would be. Taking out perhaps 3 adult plants from a population could be enough to send that population into an extinction vortex from which it can't recover. And then just briefly, I thought I'd include a slide, just to help people identify what is a wild plant. So again, they are slow growing and long-lived, and they retain these wild characteristics, which are easy to see in photos. And sometimes you will even, in photos, you can see the difference between the part of the plant that grew in the wild and the new growth that is grown in cultivation. So the main wild characteristics to look for are size and form. Obviously, if it's a very large plant, it's probably decades and decades old, and the likelihood that it was grown from seed or artificially propagated is exceedingly low. So size and form is number 1. Number 2, oftentimes there is habitat soil attached to the plants, and you can see the difference between habitat soil and nursery soil. Nursery soil would, have vermiculite or perlite or things like that, whereas, habitat soil, you can often see the difference. And then malformed or misshapen roots or stems. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of times the stems grow underground, or even sometimes when they grow above ground, they had to grow around obstacles. And you can see that, sometimes it grew around a tree, or sometimes it was growing in a rock crevice. So the plant has an oblong shape or a very irregular shape. Again, with the shape, the irregular stem shape. So the second picture on the bottom is Euphorbia buplerifolia. And in that plant, you can see that there were seasonal changes. You can see the tubercles on those plants. In some areas, they're very small and close together, and in other areas, they are further apart. So that shows you the growth that took place during the dry season and then during the growth season. Lower parts of stems woody or brown, and then often insect or animal or fire damage on plants. Obviously, that's not something that would occur in a nursery. And lichens or pathogens on plants. Lichens is a telltale sign. Lichens almost never occur on artificially propagated plants, and that plant has to have sat in habitat in that same position for a minimum of 3 to 5 years before lichens would start growing on them. And then missing or cut back leaves or roots. So obviously when plants are harvested, it's often from hard ground, so the roots would be chopped off. Leaves or stems are often chopped back just to reduce the size and obviously make it easier to move, but also then it serves the purpose of stimulating regrowth once it's planted out. And then the last one, there's obviously other damage caused by harvesting. You can see on the plant on the right, when it was being dug out, it was obviously damaged. And then I've just included a slide around legislation. So obviously this is not an exhaustive list of legislation, but I've just tried to include the most pertinent legislation. Number 1, would be the CITES legislation. So CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and it's an international, what do you call it? A convention. But in South Africa, in NEMA, which is the National Environmental Management and Biodiversity Act, we actually have CITES regulations in NEMA itself. So although it is an international convention, we have also adopted that convention into our national legislation in South Africa. And then we have the NEMBA TOPS regulations. And then I've just included the conservation ordinances and acts per province. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Just unshare your screen. Great. We are going to be running over time, but this is a super complex issue, and we need you to see all of that and stick with us. Our last speaker is coming to us from the metropolis of Kamiskroon, and Ben-John will be giving us a bit of a background as to the proactive conservation things happening on the ground. So Ben-John is currently working on biodiversity stewardship and protected area expansion through the Wilderness Foundation Northern Cape Land Project in the whole Succulent Karoo biome, but mostly up in the Namakwa region. He'll show you some maps now. He's been in conservation since 2005 and has a background including predator research projects, ecosystem rehabilitation in the Northern Cape National Parks, and latterly this very important work in protected area expansion. Thank you, Ben-John.
Thank you, Rupert. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, all good. See you well too.
Okay. Yeah. So yes, the buzzing metropolis of Kamiskroon, also known as the soul of the Succulent Karoo, or as a good friend of mine says, it's the center of the universe. So take your pick. After seeing some of the maps that Ishmael sent or shared with us, I think it's also the center of the illegal plant trade in Conophytum. So what I'm going to talk to you about is some of the protected area expansion work we do through the Wilderness Foundation African Northern Cape Land Project. Wilderness Foundation is also involved in other anti-poaching initiatives, such as the anti-rhino poaching initiatives, and our team in Port Elizabeth do a lot of work in awareness in places like Vietnam and elsewhere. So this is basically, and Rupert, please help me with my timing. If there's about 3 minutes left, please just give me that indication. I will try to run through this as quick as possible. So yeah, one of the guiding documents we use for the protected area expansion work we do is the work Philip Desmond did for the Leslie Hill Succulent Karoo Trust and the WWF, the investment priorities and the status quo and spatial priorities report, which guides the efforts of the trust and WWF, but also our project. So, and the latest document includes the following. While illegal harvesting can be considered the most pressing immediate threat facing biodiversity, it is a thematic issue that applies to the whole biome rather than any particular geographic area. Dealing with this threat requires a measure of urgency and a clear strategy that will involve all conservation partners, conservation agencies, and landowners. So what we do in principle is not specifically focused on the illegal plant trade, But I believe that it is, if a protected area strategy is well executed and planned and implemented, it forms the perfect platform and can be a good catalyst for efforts against the illegal plant trade. Because protected area expansion involve conservation partners, government, and also landowners, which I believe is a key partner in combating illegal plant trade. Okay, so I just want to see if I can give you my laser pointer. So this is one of the areas that we work in. Since October 2015, we've been in our phase one of our project. We focused our efforts on consolidating and expanding the Namakwa National Park, and also the Guchap Nature Reserve and in their buffer zone. So if we could overlay the map that Ishmael shared, it would include some of these areas. Some of the documents and guidelines we use for doing our planning, we obviously consult the department responsible for the environment in the Northern Cape, but also SANParks, as they are the management authority of the Namakwa National Park. We include layers like the threatened species layer. We also look at poorly protected vegetation types in the planning domain. We look at the critical biodiversity areas, the protected area expansion strategy, and we include places that SANParks regard as priorities for their consolidation of the park, and obviously the Leslie Hill investment priorities documents. So this is the northern section of the area we work in. Then we have the Tankwa Karoo area, which includes ecological corridor, which connects the Tankwa Karoo National Park to the Cedarburg Wilderness area. So if we achieve our goal, we would then have a connected protected area network, or a mega interprovincial protected area of around 240,000 hectares through this area that forms about 22,000 hectares. So yeah, and it is, I will go into a bit more detail, but this is mostly built through a protected area model called a protected environment, which I will expand on a little bit later. Okay, so the mechanisms we use for this, for protected area expansion in the Succulent Karoo is firstly purchase. It's the conventional way of securing areas as protected area. It's basically where government becomes the management authority, be it SANParks or the province. That includes that into the management domain of most of the time, a already established nature reserve, or in the case of SANParks, a contract national park. And then we have the more creative side and more complex side of our work, which includes the contractual or biodiversity stewardship. Then we negotiate nature reserve or contract national parks, contractual agreements with private landowners. And the third one is protected environments, which I will elaborate on in the following slide. So yeah, so the protected area model is basically designed to accommodate landowners who still need to make a living off the land. It is, sorry, my slides are jumping around a bit. They aren't able or aren't willing necessarily to declare their property as a nature reserve or a contract park, because those are managed for biodiversity purposes only. A protected environment also allows for commercial use of the natural resources, but in a sustainable manner, which is guided by a management plan that we assist the landowners or management authority to submit as part of the declaration. It provides statutory protection, but is not as strong as that of a nature reserve or a contract park. It is extremely difficult to manage the illegal plant trade because of the vast areas and largely uninhabited areas. So, and as Ishmael also said, it is poverty-stricken areas. So these empty landscapes in terms of people contributes to that. And why I mention that is the role of the protected environment, and the advantages of that is, the protected environment allows for the landowner to remain the landowner, which keeps the landowners on the property, and what we like to call them stewards in the landscape, and keep the people on the ground instead of purchasing the land and where government with their limited resources now need to manage the property. It also gives the newly declared protected environment a legal framework for the protection, and it also takes away a lot of the responsibilities of the state. It comes down to 1 or 2 visits per annum that the authority or the conservation agency needs to do to manage the area. And then protected environments is often, as I said earlier, is a catalyst for partnerships and also shared resources that can be allocated to anti-poaching initiatives or actions, but also others like rehabilitation and other initiatives that might be necessary for managing the protected area. So yeah, that in a nutshell is what I have to say. Thanks, Rupert.
Thanks, Benjon. Yeah, guys, like I said, we are running a bit over time, but this is the end of the formal presentations. If there are any burning questions, we've been trying to answer them in the chat as they happen from the various presenters. But I think the key thing here is this is a super dynamic environment we're operating in. You know, so as we saw from the third presentation, the online trade is really sophisticated, and us on the ground are not yet sophisticated, you know, in terms of making sure that we have a good understanding of how all the legislation fits together, how we raise resources together and deploy the scarce resources that we have. So it's not a happy ending to this webinar by any means of the sorry, I mangled that metaphor, by any means of the imagination. But we are, as you can see, there's a range of people working here trying to get to a solution. And I would say watch this space to see what we can do. We definitely want to be raising resources at BotSoc so that we can support all these mechanisms. These are new resource requirements that there are. It's not like they are running projects that we can tag this onto. It's a new threat, which needs new responses, as well as a lot of civil society assistance, and that's why you're here. On that, though, I just wanted to switch gear very quickly. I think we've sufficiently answered the questions that we could in the text, but if you want to continue the conversation, I've pasted the post-webinar meeting link in the chat, so we can continue there. Some of the panelists will be able to join us. I do at this stage want to thank all of them for their contribution and really giving us a good overview of the complexity of this issue. But right now, I just want to switch gear a little bit and remind us that we are less than, what's the time now? Yeah, less than 6 hours away from the start of the City Nature Challenge. iNaturalist came up tangentially in one of the talks, but we at BotSoc and people at Crew and Sandy and lots of other people are pushing to see how we can raise the profile of the City Nature Challenge and make sure that we have lots and lots of observations across the country. If you need more information, go and check out our previous webinar on citizen science, where we laid out the history as well as what we do with the data. But it's really exciting to see that we've got participation from across the country, and from a BotSoc point of view, it's really nice to see how these are linked to our branches on the ground. For example, Nelson Mandela Bay is our Goa branch. Southern Africa Rural would cover everyone in between. City of Cape Town is Kirstenbosch branch, as well as Kogelberg and West Coast branches, which are adjacent. And I know there are members that are going to be coming in for the challenge to contribute. And the City of the Garden Route, we've got our Garden Route branch there, and the Formidable Outramps group, the Crew group. And also, sorry, cut off at the bottom, but the City of Tshwane has got a lot going on. So with the link that I pasted in the chat as well, we just posted a blog on the BotSoc website, which gives you further instructions, introduction to the challenge and how to access the various projects and participate. And the cool thing about Tshwane is that it's also a collaboration between the Pretoria branch, the Bankenveld branch, as well as the Gauteng Crew branch, Crew group. So we're really trying to pull all the strings together. So I also want to thank you for joining. I see there are some hands in chats, I'll see now, but just to formally say thank you for joining. Our next webinar will be talking about South African medicinal plants and their threats, and that's as usual the 4th Thursday of each month, or the last Thursday of each month. So the 27th of May, same time, same place. Let's just see. Thank you, Ishmael. Won't be able to join us because it is sunset and fast, so he's off to break fast. Harold, if you want to join us in the next session, then we can talk properly. But I want to thank all of you for your attention. The speakers have been great. Please support the Botanical Society. Go and look at the City Nature Challenge. We'll be sharing updates from across the country on the Botanical Society Instagram and Facebook pages. And also thank you to Madeleine from VetLink also and Heather Dalton from our Southern Overberg branch, as well as Love Green, for supporting us over there as well in the background. So have a good evening and see you in like 2 minutes over at the